Both pilots are unconscious. The words weren't shouted, they were whispered, barely audible over the hum of the engines. But in that moment, everything changed. 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, one engine flickering, and not a single certified pilot left awake. Passengers kept scrolling, flight attendants kept smiling. Only one woman knew what was really happening. She wasn't on the manifest as a pilot. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore jeans, a navy sweater, a quiet past. And when the cockpit door opened, so did every memory she tried to bury. Let's check in. 1 if it's your first time, 2 if you've watched a few, 3 if you never miss. You're watching Veteran Biker, where real strength speaks without rank. Subscribe for more untold stories. Let's begin. Both pilots are unconscious. The words weren't shouted. They were whispered, passed in fragments like static, behind the thin curtain that separated first class from the unknown. At 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, there was no room for shouting. Not yet. Not when 127 passengers sat in blissful ignorance, lulled by the hum of the engines and the false promise of routine. Among them, in seat 14C, Cassie Rowan turned a page in her book without reading it. The spine of the paperback creaked in her hand, but her eyes weren't on the print. They were flicking upward, narrowing ever so slightly at the subtle shift in engine pitch. Most people wouldn't hear it. Most people would never notice the difference between a cruise-level trim correction and a deliberate manual adjustment. But Cassie wasn't most people. To the rest of the cabin, she looked unremarkable. Jeans, navy sweater, ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry, no noise. She'd boarded quietly, stowed her worn backpack beneath the seat, and kept to herself. Just another tired traveler heading home from Lisbon, perhaps after a business trip or a long-delayed vacation. No one saw the military scars beneath the civilian skin. No one asked why she watched the cabin crew more than the movie screen. No one recognized the discipline behind her stillness, and that was exactly how she wanted it. For 5 years she'd lived like this, under radar, out of uniform, erased. But instincts honed over 3,000 flight hours, and 2 wars didn't fade. They settled deep, reawakening not with fear, but with clarity. The flight had been smooth for the first 6 hours. Cassie had noticed minor anomalies, but nothing alarming. Until now. Ashley Turner, the lead flight attendant, had passed by 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Each time her smile thinned. Each time her glances toward the cockpit lingered a little longer. Behind her, Luis Morales stood stationed near the flight deck with a service cart he wasn't using. His hand hovered too long near the emergency intercom, and Cassie knew, just as she'd known years ago, seconds before her CO gave the wrong command in a training exercise that almost ended in a mid-air collision. She'd broken protocol that day, disobeyed the chain of command to prevent disaster. It had saved 2 pilots, 2 aircraft, and it had cost her everything. A soft chime sounded from the cabin ceiling, then again in rapid succession, a subtle signal, routine to most ears. But Cassie's body stiffened. 3 chimes, forward call, urgent. She closed her book, slid it into the seat pocket in front of her, and adjusted her seatbelt like she was simply shifting. Then she leaned into the aisle casually and looked forward. That's when she saw him. Seat 12A, civilian clothes, button-down shirt, plain slacks, but his posture gave him away. Shoulders square, eyes scanning in patterns, bag stowed within perfect reach under the seat. His hand rested exactly where a concealed holster would be. Federal Air Marshal, confirmed. Cassie didn't hesitate. She stood, walked forward slowly, not rushing, not hesitating. Her body moved with the kind of quiet purpose that didn't need announcing. At row 12, the man looked up. Their eyes met. She gave a fractional nod, one she hadn't used since she was in uniform. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He didn't stop her, he didn't move, he just watched. She reached the galley where Ashley was pouring coffee she wasn't planning to serve. "Ma'am," Ashley said quickly, recovering, "please return to your seat. Cassie cut her off with a voice low and controlled. "I know something's wrong. I can help." "Excuse me? You're not just changing course for turbulence. The CO pilot hasn't made a single PA announcement in over 20 minutes. And your cart hasn't moved in at least 15. I saw the captain collapse through the galley door reflection 3 minutes ago. And if your other pilot is in trouble, you're about to lose control of this aircraft." Ashley froze. Cassie didn't blink. "I'm not a passenger. I'm a former naval aviator with 15 years in the seat. Carrier landings, combat missions, over 3,000 hours logged. You need help. I'm offering it." Ashley's lips parted, then closed. Before she could respond, the Air Marshal stepped into the galley. He had his badge out already. "I heard everything," he said. His voice was calm, measured. "Name, Cassie Rowan. Affiliation, former U.S. Navy, FA-18 Super Hornet pilot, honorable discharge technically, court-martialed for insubordination 5 years ago." Ashley raised an eyebrow. The Marshal didn't. "Explain." "Training exercise. Collision course between 2 aircraft due to a miscalculation from my squadron leader. Not enough time to clear through the chain of command. I broke formation, forced evasive maneuvers, saved both. He was the son of an admiral. I paid for the politics." The Marshal looked at Ashley, then back to Cassie. "And you think you can land this aircraft? Not from 14C, but yes, this is a Boeing 737-800. I've flown larger, the controls are different, the physics aren't." Ashley hesitated, then reached for the intercom. "We need Dr. Gray in the galley." Less than a minute later, a grey-haired man in business-class slacks and a wrinkled Oxford shirt arrived with a medical bag slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, focused. "The pilots?" Ashley asked. "Stable vitals," he said, glancing at Cassie with curiosity, "but completely unresponsive. Pupils reactive, breathing steady. It's like they're in a medically induced coma. Cause? Still unknown. My guess is something they ingested." Both had their own labeled coffee thermoses, still warm, still half full. They're the only 2 affected. The Marshal processed it quickly. "Targeted." Cassie nodded. "You need to open the cockpit." "That door's locked," Ashley said. "Manual override," Cassie replied. "You have it. Or your Marshal does. You need to let me in now before autopilot starts trimming past safety margins." The Marshal pulled out his phone and stepped back to call headquarters. As he spoke, low and fast, Ashley looked Cassie over like she was scanning a weapon. "If you're lying, if you're not who you say you are, then 127 people die." Cassie's voice was ice, "including me." The Marshal hung up. "Command confirms temporary authority granted under emergency protocol. You're authorized to enter the cockpit. But if you so much as touch a switch the wrong way, I will put a bullet in you before you can say flap speed." Cassie gave a thin, humorless smile. "I've heard worse threats, usually from admirals." Ashley keyed in the override. The green light blinked. The lock disengaged. The door creaked open. The cockpit was too quiet. Cassie stepped in. Captain Nate Delano was slumped over the controls, his body inert and lifeless save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His headset dangled loosely from one ear, the mic swinging with each minor vibration of the aircraft. Beside him, First Officer Jean Shaw sat rigid in her seat, upright only because her 5-point harness held her there, her head tilted back at an unnatural angle, eyes closed, jaw slack. The eerie stillness in the cockpit was broken only by the steady hum of the instruments and the quiet hiss of the pressurized cabin air. Cassie didn't rush toward them. There was nothing she could do medically, and no time to waste on shock. She stepped sideways, moving with silent precision, and lowered herself into the left seat, the captain's seat, a place she hadn't occupied in over 5 years. But as her fingers found the armrest and her right hand reached instinctively for the yoke, muscle memory surged to the surface. There was no hesitation in her grip. Her hands were steady, controlled, familiar. She scanned the panel quickly, altitude holding at 35,042 feet, heading locked at 284, autopilot engaged, navigation indicators stable, but only for now. A trained eye could see the signs of subtle struggle beneath the surface. The aircraft had begun layering in micro-corrections to maintain course. Minor but escalating overcompensations in the lateral trim, subtle drift in rudder bias, and engine 2's temperature creeping slightly above baseline. These were not catastrophic issues yet, but they were accumulating. The system was patching over the problem, not solving it. And systems, like people, could only compensate for so long before the cracks widened. Cassie leaned forward and toggled the comm switch. "A Merry Sky 322 to ATC, do you copy?" she said, her voice steady, clipped, all business. For a beat, only static replied. Then came a voice, "ATC to a Merry Sky 322, go ahead." Cassie wasted no time. "This is not the original flight crew. I am emergency pick, former military aviator, assuming temporary control of the aircraft due to incapacitated pilots. Request vector to Great Lakes International, emergency descent clearance and confirmation of EMS on standby." Another pause. Then the response came with calm urgency. "A Merry Sky 322 confirmed. You are cleared for emergency reroute. Maintain current heading and descend to flight level 280. Emergency services will be waiting. Please advise of any system anomalies. Roger that." Standing by for further, she answered, and let her hand fall from the switch. She leaned back, not in relaxation, but in that poised, tightly wound focus of someone reacquainting themselves with an old battlefield. Ashley appeared behind her in the cockpit doorway, voice hushed but alert. "Do you need support?" "Yes," Cassie replied without hesitation. "Anyone on board with cockpit experience?" Ashley thought for a second. "There's a man in 4C, retired airline pilot, and a woman in 6D, teaches small craft." Cassie nodded once. "Bring them both forward." Her eyes never left the panel as Ashley moved off. The glow of the instruments lit her face with the quiet intimacy of an old ritual being performed again after years in exile. She adjusted her grip on the yoke, not too tight, not too light, and allowed herself a single breath, deep and slow. And that's when it hit her. Not fear, not doubt, but that unmistakable feeling she'd thought she'd buried forever. The click, the shift, the internal gear that engaged when a pilot stopped watching and started flying. The moment when the hypothetical dissolved, when the past ceased to matter and only the mission remained. She was flying again, but this time there was no CO pilot to rely on, no Rio in the back seat feeding her telemetry, no carrier deck waiting to catch her with a tailhook and arrest a cable. There was only the sky, the steel, the controls beneath her fingers, and 127 strangers praying silently in their seats that whoever had just taken control of the plane still remembered how to bring them home. The cockpit, silent, but for the systems, felt both foreign and completely familiar. Cassie's hands gripping the yoke felt the faint tremors, the subtle vibrations that were the plane's heartbeat. After 5 years of translating complex engineering specs for government contractors, a sterile, silent world of words and data, this felt like coming home. The worn leather of the captain's seat, the faint metallic scent of ozone and recycled air, the dizzying array of lights and dials. It was all different from her Super Hornet, but the language was the same, the language of flight. She took a deep breath, her eyes flicking across the instruments in a practiced fluid scan. Her focus was absolute. An internal switch flipped from observer to commander. The autopilot was holding steady, but Cassie could feel it strain. She watched the attitude indicator, the artificial horizon, and saw the minute, almost imperceptible corrections it was making. It was like a patient struggling against a fever. The system was fighting something it wasn't designed to diagnose. Behind her, she heard the hushed voices of Ashley Turner and the Air Marshal Marcus Dean. "Doctor!" Gray was also there, his pale face illuminated by the cockpit's eerie green glow, still holding his medical bag. The atmosphere was charged with a kind of terrified awe. They had no idea what they were looking at, but they understood the gravity of the moment. Their lives now depended on the quiet, unassuming woman in the captain's seat. Cassie toggled the comm switch again, her voice betraying none of the tension she felt. "Mary Sky 322 to ATC, please advise on the diversion. ETA to Great Lakes, and any traffic in our new flight path." The answer came back quickly. "Mary Sky 322, your new ETA is approximately 45 minutes. We are routing all incoming traffic to the north to clear your path. We have an open runway and full emergency services on standby. Roger that, ATC. Appreciate the support." She let her hand drop from the switch, then turned her head slightly to face the galley. "Ashley, did you get those passengers?" Ashley, still shaken by the rapid turn of events, nodded. "Yes, they're coming. Mr. Pierce and Ms. Ruiz." Cassie's eyes returned to the panel. She needed a crew. She couldn't do this alone, not with the complexity of a civilian aircraft and systems she was only half familiar with. Her brain, however, was already building the mental model of the Boeing 737-800. She was a quick study. The manuals had been her Bible for years, and now, finally, the technical schematics were no longer theory, they were reality. She was a systems manager, a pilot, a commander, all at once. A few moments later, two new faces appeared in the doorway behind Ashley. The first was an older man with silver hair and tired but sharp eyes. He wore a crisp golf shirt and khakis, the easy posture of someone who had spent decades in the air. The second was a younger woman, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and professional curiosity. "This is Daniel Pierce, retired United pilot," Ashley whispered. "And this is Helen Ruiz, flight instructor." Cassie didn't turn to face them. Her gaze was locked on the instrument panel, her mind already calculating descent rates and fuel burn. "Daniel," she said, her voice cutting through the silent tension, "I need you to act as my co-pilot. I need your knowledge of this aircraft's systems and procedures. Helen, you're on communication and navigation. I'll be flying the plane. No questions, no argument. We have a job to do. Get in the seats behind us and get ready to work." Daniel and Helen exchanged a look of disbelief, but the authority in Cassie's voice was absolute. Daniel, the veteran of countless flights, seemed to instantly recognize the calm competence of a pilot in command. He didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." Helen, a flight instructor accustomed to teaching rather than being commanded, was a little slower to react, but the urgency of the situation was undeniable. "Understood." As they took their positions in the jump seats, the cockpit began to feel less like a tomb and more like a command center. Cassie's senses, however, were on high alert. The subtle, almost imperceptible overcorrections she had noticed earlier were now more pronounced. The autopilot was working harder, a constant digital whirring audible to her ears alone. The aircraft's body was twisting in a subtle but persistent way, as if fighting an unseen current. "Daniel!" she said, her voice low and focused. "I'm seeing some anomalies in the lateral trim. Autopilot is compensating, but it feels sticky." Daniel leaned forward, his face etched with concern. He knew what she was talking about. This was the kind of thing that was only noticeable to someone who spent their life in the air. Could be a minor hydraulic leak or a sensor malfunction. Or, Cassie countered, it's an engine issue. Just as the words left her mouth, a faint amber light flickered on the engine management display. It was a single, innocuous little light, the kind that might go unnoticed by an exhausted flight crew on a long haul. But to Cassie's trained eye, it was a siren. It indicated a subtle over-temperature on the right engine, the one designated engine 2. It was a sign of destabilization, a prelude to something far worse. "Helen, get me ATC. I need a weather report for Great Lakes International." Crosswinds, ground speed, everything. Cassie's mind was racing now, running through every possible scenario. An engine issue combined with an unknown environmental contaminant in the cockpit, all with an untrained crew. This was a nightmare scenario. "What is that light?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with a professional dread. "Engine 2? Cassie didn't answer. She was watching the number beside the light, the temperature reading, slowly creep up. The autopilot, in its digital innocence, was trying to compensate by increasing the thrust on the opposing engine, hoping to maintain speed and altitude. It was, in effect, fighting the problem blindly. "Okay, ATC confirms crosswind at 15 knots, gusting to 20. Helen reported, her voice shaky. Cassie's jaw tightened. A crosswind with a failing engine. That was the kind of combination that could turn a difficult landing into a catastrophe. Her military training had been for fighter jets, single pilot, high-G maneuvering, high-speed, controlled crashes onto a moving deck. This was different. This was a heavy, lumbering commercial aircraft designed to be flown with grace and precision by a crew of 2. She was a one-woman show, a pilot who'd been grounded for 5 years, trying to tame a beast she'd only ever read about. "We need to manually take control," Cassie said, her voice low but firm. "Autopilot is overcompensating. We risk a thermal runaway. Take control?" Daniel's voice was filled with alarm. "You haven't flown this aircraft before. The protocols, they're different. The inputs, the physics are the same, Daniel. We don't have a choice. Autopilot is a crutch. We need to be the legs." Cassie reached out and, with a swift, decisive motion, disengaged the autopilot. The aircraft immediately lurched to the right, the result of the now uncompensated temperature imbalance. Cassie's hands moved with practiced speed, correcting the yaw with a precise application of rudder. The plane stabilized, but she could feel the continuous pressure needed to keep it straight and level. She was now completely and irrevocably flying the plane. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Marcus Dean, the Air Marshal, had been silent, but she could feel his eyes on her back. He had authorized this, and now he was watching to see if his gamble had paid off. Dr. Gray, meanwhile, was huddled over the 2 unconscious pilots, occasionally checking their vitals, his brow furrowed with a desperate professional concern. "What about the passengers?" Ashley's voice was a barely audible whisper. "Do we tell them?" "No," Cassie replied, her eyes locked on the panel. "Not yet. Acknowledge a minor technical issue and that we are being diverted. Nothing more. We can't afford a panic." Just then, Marcus Dean leaned forward, his voice a low, tactical murmur. "I have information on that mysterious passenger at the one in business class, seat 2A, a man named Marcus Webb. The flight manifest lists him as an employee of a small aerospace consultancy, but his file is odd. The profile is incomplete. I'm running a full background check now." But the flight crew at Lisbon reported a minor security issue with him at the gate. He was attempting to bypass screening with a stolen employee badge. Cassie's blood ran cold. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to click into place. An ex-employee, a stolen badge, a mysterious sedative, and 2 pilots incapacitated. It wasn't just a random medical emergency, it was a deliberate act of sabotage. This was no longer just a technical problem, it was a criminal investigation. A terrorism incident. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just been raised to a terrifying new level. FBI will be notified, Marcus said, his voice hard. We'll be treated as a crime scene upon landing, and that passenger will be a person of interest. Cassie, however, was already moving past the fear and the horror. She was a tactician, and a tactician deals with the facts in front of her. The fact was, she had a plane to land, and that plane had a failing engine. She couldn't afford to be distracted by a manhunt. Helen, I need you to communicate with ATC. Tell them we're going to hold at a lower altitude while we assess the engine. Daniel, get out the 737 to 800's checklist for a single engine emergency landing. I need the speed protocols, the flap settings, and the hydraulic redundancy information. Every single detail. As Helen and Daniel began their work, a new, more insistent warning light flashed on the panel. Not amber this time, but a deep, angry red. Engine 2's temperature had spiked, the needle jumping into the red zone. The automated voice of the aircraft's warning system cut through the tense silence, a robotic, calm voice announcing the end of the line. Engine 2 failure. Engine 2 failure. Right engine, the voice repeated its chilling mantra 3 times. The right engine, with a final shudder and a metallic grinding sound that was felt more than heard, fell silent. The entire aircraft lurched dramatically to the right, a violent jolt that sent a wave of panic through the cabin and caused Cassie to apply a massive amount of rudder to correct the yaw. The plane leveled out, but the shift in its physics was immediate and profound. The asymmetric thrust was now a permanent, powerful force. She was no longer flying a balanced aircraft. She was flying a kite in a hurricane, held aloft by the strength of a single wing. "Okay," Cassie said, her voice a calm exhale. "Okay, this is happening." She toggled the comm switch again, American Sky 322 to ATC. "We have a confirmed Engine 2 failure, declaring full emergency. We are proceeding with a single-engine approach, requesting immediate vectors for a new flight path and a confirmation of our runway. And please advise ground that we are now officially flying on one engine." There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end of the line. The reality of their situation, an uncertified pilot, an incapacitated crew, and now a crippled aircraft, was settling in. Then, the voice of the controller, now heavy with a professional somberness, came back. "American Sky 322, ATC copies, single-engine emergency. We are clearing all other air traffic from your path. Now we have Great Lakes International on the line. We will give you a straight in. You're cleared to fly, over." And with that, the die was cast. There was no more mystery, no more waiting, no more discussion. The time for talking was over. The time for flying had begun. Cassie Rowan, the disgraced pilot in jeans and a navy sweater, was now the sole hope for 127 souls in a machine that was no longer an aircraft, but a weapon. And she was holding it together with nothing but her skill, her guts, and her long-buried memories of how to fly. The aircraft, now a heavy, asymmetrical beast, bucked and yawed under the sudden silence of its right engine. The silence was a roar. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of a severed nerve, a missing half. Cassie's hands, gripping the yoke, felt the immense continuous pressure needed to counteract the yaw from the single remaining engine. The aircraft wanted to turn right, to spiral down, to obey the unyielding law of physics. Cassie was fighting that law, moment by moment, with the raw, disciplined strength in her arms and the thousands of hours of instinct in her mind. The cockpit's atmosphere had shifted again. The raw fear that had been present since the pilot's collapse had given way to a steely professional focus. The improvised crew, a patchwork of strangers united by a single terrifying purpose, was now a functioning team. "Daniel, get out the checklist for engine failure in flight," Cassie commanded, her voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the low thrum of the left engine. "I need you to confirm every single step. Don't assume anything." "Helen, get on the radio. Tell ATC we're beginning our descent and need our final approach instructions. Marcus, keep me updated on what you're hearing from the ground. I need to know what they're saying about the security threat." Daniel, his face pale but his eyes sharp, tore open the thick red-bound manual. The pages rustled, a sound of paper against plastic, a stark contrast to the real-world crisis outside the cockpit window. He began reading, his voice a steady drone, ticking off items with the precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times in a simulator. "Engine 2, confirmed shutdown. Bleed air switch, off. Fuel crossfeed valve, open." Cassie's hands moved fluidly, a pilot's ballet of button presses and switch toggles. She performed each step from memory, but Daniel's confirmation was the crucial safeguard. She was an aviator, but he was a Boeing 737 pilot, and his knowledge was the only thing standing between her instinct and a potentially fatal procedural error. Meanwhile, Helen, her voice now completely steady, was relaying information to Great Lakes ATC. "Ameri Sky 322. We have initiated emergency descent. We are on a single-engine approach, requesting confirmation of our straight-in approach to runway 4R and any new wind data." Her calm tone was a stark contrast to the wild turbulence of her emotions, but like Cassie, she was forcing herself to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate task. "ATC confirms straight-in approach, runway 4R. Winds are steady, 15 knots, crosswind from the west. They are coordinating with ground to have a Boeing technical advisor on the line to assist with any systems questions," Helen reported back, her voice full of a newfound confidence. "Thank you, Helen. We'll take all the help we can get." Cassie adjusted the thrust on the remaining engine, careful not to push it too hard. She was acutely aware of the single point of failure now. The plane's life, and everyone on it, was now entirely dependent on that one overworked engine. She was nursing it, a fragile humming heart under immense strain. Marcus Dean, the Air Marshal, leaned forward. His tactical mindset, which had initially been focused on neutralizing a threat, was now fully engaged in coordinating a rescue. "FBI on the ground is working with Great Lakes Security. They're confirming the identity of the passenger, Marcus Webb. They've discovered he was a former Ameri Sky maintenance tech, fired 6 months ago. The theft of the employee badge at London Heathrow was a confirmed, intentional act." The revelation hung in the air, a chilling confirmation of their worst fears. This was no accident. This was an act of terror, cold and calculated, designed to send 127 people to their deaths. Yet, even that didn't distract Cassie from the controls. The horror of the act was a problem for the authorities. Her problem was to land the plane. They had begun the descent, a slow, controlled drop from 35,000 feet. The aircraft, heavier and less responsive with one engine, required constant attention. Cassie's hands were no longer a pilot's ballet, they were a sculptor's tools, constantly correcting, constantly adjusting. The rudder pedals under her feet demanded a continuous, precise pressure to prevent the plane from drifting right. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Speed, angle of attack, altitude, wind shear. She was drawing on every piece of knowledge she had, mixing military high-performance flying with a civilian pilot's need for gentle, precise control. She could feel the fatigue beginning to set in, the constant pressure on her muscles, the mental strain of holding a crippled aircraft steady. 5 years of desk work had dulled her physical endurance, but not her will. She pushed through it, a grim determination etched on her face. "Daniel, what are the VREF speeds for a single-engine landing on this model?" she asked, her voice tight with concentration. Daniel flipped to the next section in the manual, his fingers flying across the pages. VREF, depending on weight, is around 140 knots, a bit higher for single-engine. They want us to land with 30 degrees of flaps, not the full 40. Why? Asymmetric drag. Full flaps with one engine would make it unstable. We'd have a much steeper descent, and it would be harder to control. Makes sense. We'll be coming in hot then. Cassie's mind was already adjusting. A steeper, faster descent meant less room for error. The landing would be harder, but it was safer. This was the kind of on-the-fly decision-making she lived for, the kind of professional judgment that had gotten her court-martialed 5 years ago. And now it was the only thing that could save them. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. The glow of the instruments, the endless hum of the left engine, the hushed voices of her crew, they all blurred into a single, focused reality. The outside world had ceased to exist. There was only the plane and the destination. "ATC confirms we're on final approach," Helen announced. "Boeing advisors are on the line now. They want to talk you through a few things." Cassie took a deep breath. "Roger that, Helen. Patch them through to the speaker." A new voice filled the cockpit, an older, calm voice with a subtle Seattle accent. "Ameri Sky 322, this is Greg, Boeing Technical Advisor. I've got your telemetry. You're doing a fantastic job. We're showing you've managed the engine failure perfectly. Thank you, Greg. I need confirmation of our flap settings for this approach. Daniel thinks 30 degrees is correct, but I want to be certain." "Confirmed. 30 degrees is the right call. We've run the simulations. You'll have a steeper approach, but it will be a much more stable one. Keep your airspeed at VREF plus 10 knots until you're over the threshold. That crosswind is going to be a factor. You'll need to use a crab approach." "I know the crab approach," Cassie said, her voice dry. "I've done it on a carrier deck with a ship that's moving." A moment of silence on the line. Then the voice of the technical advisor came back, tinged with a new respect. "Well, then you're more than prepared for this, Captain." The word captain felt both foreign and completely right, a title she had never officially held in civilian aviation. But in that moment, it was hers. They were now under 10,000 feet, the landscape of Chicago visible through the windscreen, a grid of lights stretching to the horizon. The runway was a distant line of white, a beacon of hope in a world of darkness. The tension in the cockpit was now a palpable force, a quiet electricity that filled every inch of space. Then a new voice cut through the controlled atmosphere. It was Dr. Gray, his voice a panicked gasp. "She's waking up!" The first officer. "Her eyes are flickering!" Cassie's head whipped around. The unconscious pilots had been a background problem, a reality she had put aside, but now they were a potential new crisis. First Officer Jean Shaw was indeed showing signs of consciousness, her head twitching, her eyes fluttering open and then closed again. Her body, held in place by the harness, was trying to struggle. "Stay with her, Doctor," Cassie commanded, her voice like a whip. "Do not let her touch anything." But it wasn't just the first officer. In the next moment, Captain Nate Delano, who had been completely inert, let out a low groan. His head lifted slightly, his eyes opened, unfocused and dazed. His muscle memory, honed by decades of flying, kicked in long before his conscious mind could process what had happened. His hand, as if guided by an invisible force, reached for the yoke. "He's trying to fly!" Daniel shouted, his own professional instincts screaming in horror at the thought of a disoriented, poisoned pilot making a control input at this critical stage. Daniel, with the speed of a man who had seen every nightmare scenario played out in a simulator, lunged forward. He slammed his hand down on the captain's, pinning it to the side console. "No, Captain! No! We've got it! You've been incapacitated!" Captain Delano, confused and still in a daze, thrashed weakly, his eyes darting from Daniel to Cassie, who was now flying the plane with a grim, fierce intensity. What's happening? Why is the engine? The engine is out, Captain, Cassie said, her voice now cold and clipped, focused entirely on the instruments in front of her. The plane is being flown by a new crew. You were poisoned. You need to stay calm. Doctor, sedate him if you have to. Daniel, do not let him touch those controls. The chaos in the cockpit was a stark contrast to the quiet focus needed for the single-engine landing. A disoriented pilot, a struggling doctor, a former pilot turned co-pilot restraining his captain. It was a scene that would have grounded any normal flight, but Cassie was not a normal pilot. She had been trained for this kind of chaos. She had been trained to compartmentalize, to ignore everything but the mission. "I need your focus, Daniel," she said, her voice a low growl. "I need you on the checklist, not the captain. We're in the red zone. I need your eyes on the panel, not him." Daniel, shaken but resolute, snapped back to attention. He released his grip on the captain just enough for Dr. Gray to administer a sedative, and then his eyes flew back to the checklist. "Final approach checklist is complete, Captain. We're on approach. Airspeed 160 knots. "We're too high," Cassie said, making a subtle adjustment to the trim, feeling the plane shudder as it began its final descent. "The crosswind is a factor. I'm going to have to do a side slip to get it on the center line. Get ready for a hard touchdown. This isn't going to be pretty." The plane shuddered as she pushed it harder. The wind, a new and powerful force, was pushing it left. She had to fight it every single second with a continuous, almost violent pressure on the controls. The runway, now a wide grey stripe of concrete, was getting closer, but it still looked impossibly far away. "Flaps 30 degrees, she commanded. "Flaps 30, set!" Daniel confirmed, his voice a steady drone. "Landing gear, down. Landing gear, down. 3 green lights." Daniel confirmed, his voice now filled with a newfound professional awe. This wasn't just flying. This was a masterclass in crisis management, a brutal, ugly, and beautiful display of skill under pressure. They were in the final moments of the flight. The plane, now a heavy, wounded bird, was clawing its way towards the ground, fighting every second for its life. The runway was filling the windscreen. Cassie could see the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles lining the runway, a grim guard of honor waiting to see if she would succeed or fail. She was no longer flying, she was willing the plane to the ground. She was a force of will, a ghost of her former self, and in her hands rested the fate of 127 souls. The landing that wasn't supposed to happen was about to begin, and the only thing she had to guide her was her training, her gut, and the unyielding knowledge that she had been born for this moment. The runway, a concrete ribbon stretching into the night, grew larger in the windscreen. The final descent had begun. The world outside the cockpit was a symphony of chaos, flashing lights of emergency vehicles, the distant hum of the single engine, and the relentless, unseen force of a crosswind pushing the heavy aircraft to the side. Inside, the atmosphere was one of absolute, suffocating focus. The plane was no longer flying itself. It was being willed to the ground by a woman who had no business being in the captain's seat, and she was fighting every single second for control. Daniel's voice, a steady, calm drone, was her lifeline. He was calling out the numbers that meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. "Airspeed 160 knots, he announced, his eyes glued to the instrument panel. "On glide path. Descent rate 800 feet per minute. Cassie's hands, now aching from the constant, precise pressure on the yoke and rudder pedals, were an extension of the aircraft itself. She could feel every whisper of the wind, every slight shudder of the airframe, every ounce of resistance from the crippled plane. The single, overworked engine on the left was her only friend, and she was nursing it, a delicate balance of power and prayer. The crosswind was relentless, pushing the nose of the plane a full 10 degrees to the left. She was flying in a crab, an approach she had performed on a carrier deck 1,000 times, but never with a commercial aircraft, and never with so many lives riding on her shoulders. Helen's voice, clear and precise, broke through the tension. ATC confirms straight in approach. All other traffic is cleared from the area. The runway is yours, Captain. The title felt strange and foreign. Cassie had been a major, she had been a pilot, but a captain, the title of a commercial pilot, a man or woman who flew thousands of hours in a predictable, routine world, a world that was now, for them, a distant memory. Marcus Dean, the Air Marshal, leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Ma'am, I have a message from ground. Media coverage has begun. They've got news helicopters up. They're reporting a mystery pilot has taken over the plane. They're saying the pilots are incapacitated. You're no longer anonymous." The news, which would have shaken a normal person to their core, barely registered. Cassie's mind was a fortress, a singular focus on the task at hand. The media, the public, the political fallout, it was all a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, her only job was to get the plane on the ground. The runway was closer now. She could see the individual lights, the paint, the dark patches of rubber where countless planes had landed before. It was a place of safety, but it was also the final test. The aircraft, a heavy bird with a broken wing, was about to enter the most difficult phase of its flight. "Altitude 500 feet, Daniel's voice cut through the tension. "Looking good." On glide path, Cassie made a subtle adjustment to the trim, feeling the change in pressure, the new dynamics of the air under the wings as they entered the ground effect zone. The plane was more responsive now, but also more sensitive to the turbulent winds close to the ground. She was fighting a ghost, an unseen shifting force that was trying to rip the plane from her control. 300 feet, Daniel announced. "We're a little high. Descent rate needs to increase." Cassie adjusted the power, a delicate, surgical movement of the throttle. The single engine whined in response, the RPMs dropping just enough to bring their descent rate back on target. She had to be careful. Too much power reduction, and the plane would stall. Too little, and they would overshoot the runway. A fatal mistake with no second chances. 200 feet, Daniel's voice was a whisper now, filled with a grim professional reverence. On centerline, crosswind steady. The moment was approaching, the moment of truth, the point where all her training, all her skill, all her discipline would be tested against the raw, unyielding physics of flight. The crosswind was a powerful, violent force, and she was fighting it with everything she had. 100 feet, Daniel announced. "Begin flare." Cassie's hands moved. She pulled back gently on the yoke, reducing the rate of descent, raising the nose of the plane a few degrees, preparing for the final violent impact. The plane was a stone falling through the air. Her job was to make it float for just a few seconds, long enough to make a safe landing, and then it happened. The final, brutal twist of the knife. The wind, which had been steady for the entire descent, shifted violently. It wasn't a gust. It was a sudden, vicious change in direction. A thermal current from the ground that hit the plane's right side like a hammer. The aircraft lurched, its nose whipping to the left, away from the runway centerline, the left wing dipping precariously low. "Wind shear!" Daniel's voice was a gasp of pure terror. "We're off center!" In that split second, a million scenarios flashed through Cassie's mind. The plane would hit the ground sideways, the landing gear would collapse, the wings would tear off, the plane would cartwheel into a catastrophic, fiery end. 5 years of civilian life, of quiet anonymity, of a past she had tried to bury, it all came rushing back. The crash that had ended her career, the political fallout, the loss of her identity. It was all a prelude to this one final horrific moment. But in that split second, her training took over. It wasn't a choice. It was a reaction. She stomped on the right rudder pedal, a full, almost violent application of force. The nose of the plane snapped back to the right, a brutal, bone-jarring correction that realigned the aircraft with the runway centerline. At the same time, she pushed the yoke to the left, raising the left wing, fighting the crosswind with a combination of controls that would have been impossible for a less skilled pilot. 50 feet. Daniel's voice was a hoarse cry, the sound of a man who had just seen a ghost. "You've got it!" The runway lights were a blur. The ground was rushing up to meet them. Cassie held the plane steady, a grim, determined force of will. She held it there, perfectly aligned with the center line, waiting for the perfect moment of impact. The touchdown. The plane's main landing gear hit the runway with a thud that was felt throughout the entire fuselage. It was a firm, controlled impact, not a crash. The right wheel hit first, a split second before the left, a subtle correction to the crosswind. Then the left wheel hit and the plane was on the ground. But it wasn't over. The plane, with its asymmetric braking and its wounded engine, began to skid to the right, the massive weight of the aircraft threatening to send it careening off the runway and into the grass. Cassie applied the wheel brakes hard to the left, wrestling the aircraft back under control with sheer grit and unyielding precision. The jet fishtailed, a massive steel beast skidding across the tarmac in a desperate fight for balance. But inch by inch, breath by breath, it obeyed, grinding its way back to the centerline with a stubborn elegance that made no sense, yet somehow held. "Nose gear down!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of adrenaline and disbelief. The nose wheel slammed onto the runway, jolting the entire frame. They were no longer airborne, no longer fighting the sky. The aircraft, once a wounded creature defying gravity, had finally returned to Earth. The lone thrust reverser engaged with a thunderous roar from the left engine, shaking the plane as it bled off speed. The lights lining the runway streaked past in a blur, racing against the fading momentum. Cassie's fingers, trembling but steady, held the yoke firm, easing the plane down the strip with quiet authority. Alongside, emergency vehicles surged in formation, their flashing reds and blues a silent tribute to the miracle unfolding before them. The jet decelerated, slower, slower, slower still, until at last it stopped, fully, finally, completely. The engine whined one final time, then fell silent, and in that moment there was nothing but stillness. The storm had passed, the chaos had ended, the impossible had just happened, and not a single word was spoken. For a long, long moment, no one in the cockpit said a word. Cassie was still, her hands on the yoke, her eyes staring out the windscreen at the world she had just saved. The silence was not peaceful. It was a deafening, terrifying silence. It was the silence of a prayer answered, a mission completed, a life saved. And then, from the passenger cabin behind them, a single voice, a single cheer. And then another, and then a whole chorus of them, a roar of pure, unadulterated relief. The passengers, who had been silent for so long, burst into a thunderous applause. They were cheering for the woman who had saved them, the pilot they had never met, the ghost who had just brought them home. Cassie, however, did not move. She did not smile. She did not take a bow. She simply sat there, staring out the windscreen at the silent, flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. The job done, the mission complete, the past resurrected, and the future, for the first time in 5 years, completely and terrifyingly unknown. The moment the plane stopped, the silence was deafening, a physical absence of sound that seemed to press in on everyone in the cockpit. Cassie's hands remained on the yoke, her body rigid, her mind still lost in the final, brutal seconds of the landing. The applause from the passenger cabin was a distant roar, a foreign noise that seemed to have no place in the contained, sterile world of the flight deck. Then the silence was shattered. The radio crackled to life. A cacophony of voices from ground control, FBI and airport officials. Daniel, his voice hoarse, took the mic. "Amerisky 322, we are on the ground and secure. Pilots are incapacitated but have been stabilized. Emergency pilot is on the deck, requesting immediate assistance for crew and passengers." The words hung in the air, a final official acknowledgement of the impossible feat they had just accomplished. As the emergency vehicles, a blur of red and white, surrounded the aircraft, the cabin door was thrown open. A controlled storm of paramedics, FBI agents, and airport security personnel swarmed the plane. In the cockpit, Marcus Dean, the Air Marshal, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and awe. He looked at Cassie, still seated, her eyes fixed on the empty runway. "Cassie," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you did it! You brought us home!" Cassie finally moved, a slow, deliberate exhale of breath. She let go of the yoke, her hands falling into her lap. The tension that had held her body together for the last hour and a half finally broke. She was a ghost, a shell of herself. The cockpit quickly became a hub of activity. Paramedics rushed in, carefully unbuckling the unconscious pilots and preparing them for transport. Dr. Gray, his professional demeanor now fully intact, gave a rapid-fire medical report. Stable vitals, but still unresponsive. The sedative compound seems to be wearing off, but they'll need a full neurological workup. They're lucky to be alive. FBI agents, their faces grim, began their initial investigation, a quiet, methodical process of documenting everything. One of them, a lean, sharp-eyed man in a dark suit, knelt down beside Cassie. "I'm Agent Ramirez, FBI. Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions. Do you know a Marcus Webb?" The name, a forgotten piece of the puzzle, snapped into place. Cassie simply nodded. "He's the man who did this." The investigation, a meticulously coordinated machine, moved with a terrifying speed. Cassie, Daniel, Helen, and Marcus were all escorted off the plane and taken to a secure area for debriefing. The debriefings, a marathon of questions and answers, stretched on for hours. Cassie's account, calm, precise, and devoid of any emotion, laid out the timeline of events the moment she noticed the pilots were incapacitated, the rapid-fire interrogation by Marcus Dean, the discovery of the engine failure, and the final terrifying moments of the landing. Agent Ramirez listened intently, his pen flying across a notepad. And the landing? The sudden wind shear? Cassie's eyes, for the first time, held a flicker of the trauma. It was just a correction, a reaction. I had no time to think. I just flew the plane. The FBI's initial findings confirmed her story. They had already identified the saboteur, Marcus Webb, a disgruntled former Amerisky maintenance technician who had been fired 6 months earlier for falsifying safety records. He had used a stolen employee badge to gain access to the crew thermoses at Lisbon, lacing the coffee with a powerful, custom-designed sedative. His plan was simple and horrifying: create an unsolvable aviation disaster that would be blamed on mechanical failure, a final act of revenge against the company that had fired him. He hadn't accounted for Cassie Rowan. As the sun rose over Chicago, painting the sky with a soft, pale light, the investigation began to transition from a criminal case to a story of heroism. The FAA began its review of the flight, the NTSB dispatched a team to analyze the black boxes, and the media, now in a frenzy, began to unravel the impossible story of Flight 322. In the midst of the chaos, a new player arrived. A woman in a crisp Navy uniform, a full admiral, a rarity outside of the Pentagon. Admiral Patricia Hayes, a woman with a steely gaze and a reputation for justice, walked directly toward Cassie, who was sitting in a quiet corner of the hangar, a blanket wrapped around her. "Major Rowan," the Admiral said, using the rank Cassie hadn't heard in 5 years. Cassie's head snapped up. The title, the rank, the woman's face, it all brought back a flood of memories, of a past she had tried to leave behind. "Admiral Hayes," Cassie replied, her voice filled with a mixture of respect and apprehension. The Admiral pulled up a chair and sat down, her posture straight and unyielding. "I've been briefed on everything. Your file, your court-martial, your actions tonight. We've been following your progress in the skies over the Atlantic. Your telemetry, your communications, your landing, it's all on record, and it's all textbook." Cassie remained silent, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "5 years ago," the Admiral continued, her voice low and firm, "a panel of officers ruled that you had violated the chain of command. They said your actions, while well-intentioned, could not be tolerated. They prioritized the sanctity of military protocol over the lives of 2 pilots. They were wrong." Cassie's eyes, which had been so dead and empty, now welled with tears. The words, the validation she had been denied for so long, hit her like a physical blow. "I have initiated a full review of your case. A new panel, myself included, has been assembled. We have re-examined the data, the testimony, and the facts. And we have concluded, with no dissenting votes, that your actions 5 years ago were a heroic act of judgment, not an act of insubordination. Your conviction is officially overturned. Your rank is restored. We want you back, Major, with full honors. We need pilots who can make the right call when protocol fails." The offer was everything Cassie had ever wanted, a chance to return to the life that had been so cruelly taken from her, a chance to reclaim her identity, her purpose, her honor. She was a major again. Her past was finally, completely redeemed. But in that moment, a different voice, a different offer, broke through. Captain Margaret Stone, the chief pilot of Amerisky Airlines, a formidable woman in a tailored uniform, walked over and introduced herself. "Major Rowan, I've reviewed the preliminary flight data. You are a natural. The way you handled that single-engine landing with a crosswind, it was a masterclass. It was something no certified pilot could have done without years of experience on that airframe, and you did it blind. We owe you more than we can ever repay, and we would like to offer you a position." Cassie looked at the woman, her mind reeling. 2 offers, 2 paths, the past and the future. "We want you to join our team," Captain Stone continued, "not as a pilot, but as a flight trainer. We want you to design a new emergency training protocol for the entire airline, something that goes beyond the standard procedures, something that prepares our pilots for the unpredictable, for the kind of crisis you just went through. We want to call it the Rowan Protocol. It would be your legacy, a legacy that would save lives for decades to come." The choice was not a choice at all. One offer was a return to the past, a closure that she desperately needed. The other was a chance to build something new, to use her unique, traumatic experience to forge a better future. She looked at the Admiral, her face full of gratitude. "Admiral, thank you. Thank you for everything. But my flying days in the military are over. There's a different kind of war to be fought, a war against the unpredictable." The Admiral nodded slowly, a small, sad smile on her face. She understood. Cassie turned to Captain Stone. "I accept. I want to build that protocol. I want to make sure no pilot ever has to go through what I did. I want to make sure that in a crisis our pilots don't just follow a checklist, they fly the plane." The media storm that followed was unprecedented. Cassie Rowan became a national hero, a symbol of courage and resilience. Her story, the disgraced pilot who returned from anonymity to save 127 lives, captured the imagination of a nation. The national conversation on capability versus credentials became a powerful force for change, with military and civilian leaders alike acknowledging that sometimes the true measure of a person's worth lies not in their paperwork, but in their character. In the end, Marcus Webb, the disgruntled ex-employee, was captured and confessed to the crime. He was sentenced to life in federal prison. His act of revenge, which was meant to cause a catastrophic disaster, had instead led to a story of heroism and redemption. A year later, in a new training facility in Denver, a bronze plaque was unveiled. It was a simple, elegant plaque, and the words on it were a testament to the power of a single person's resolve. Prepared in silence, proven in crisis. The Rowan Protocol. The protocol, a revolutionary new approach to emergency training, was designed by Cassie herself. It taught pilots not just how to follow a checklist, but how to think, how to improvise, how to trust their instincts when everything else failed. It was her legacy, a living, breathing testament to the lives she had saved, the career she had lost, and the one she had found. And it was all born from a single terrifying flight, a pilot in jeans and a navy sweater, and the day she had to remember how to fly. The plaque, a simple piece of polished bronze, felt cool and solid beneath her fingertips. Prepared in silence, proven in crisis, the Rowan Protocol. The words were a testament to the lives saved, the career lost, and the new one forged from the ashes of a near disaster. 2 years had passed since Flight 322 landed at Great Lakes International Airport, and the world had changed. It had changed because of a single impossible flight, a quiet woman in a navy sweater, and the courage to fly a plane she had never been trained on. Cassie Rowan, now the Director of Emergency Operations Training for AmeriSky Airlines, stood on the observation deck of the new, state-of-the-art training center in Denver. Below her, a team of pilots, a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh-faced newcomers, were inside a full-motion Boeing 737-800 simulator. She watched them work, their movements precise, their voices calm and coordinated, their hands moving over the controls with practiced grace. They were running a new scenario, a brutal, unforgiving, and all too familiar one, the Rowan Protocol. On the screens around the simulator, she could see the telemetry, the flight path, the engine diagnostics. The scenario was unfolding with a chilling accuracy. Pilots incapacitated by a fast-acting sedative, a single engine failing on final approach, a crosswind threatening to tear the plane from the sky. And in the cockpit, a new protocol was being tested. It was a protocol that taught pilots not just how to fly a plane, but how to be a force of nature, a calm center in a world of chaos. It taught them to trust their gut, to improvise when the checklist ran out, and to remember that sometimes the only thing that mattered was not the protocol, but the lives that depended on it. The protocol had been her life's work. She had designed it from the ground up, drawing on her military training, her experience in combat, and the raw, unyielding lessons of Flight 322. It was a testament to the power of one person's experience, a living, breathing memorial to the day she had been a ghost and had become a legend. The industry had been slow to accept it at first. The FAA, an institution built on regulation and procedure, was hesitant to embrace a protocol that preached improvisation over rigid rules, but the data didn't lie. The black box recordings from Flight 322 were a national treasure, a minute-by-minute account of Cassie's impossible landing. The Boeing engineers had confirmed that her corrections, her split-second decisions, her intuitive understanding of the plane's physics had saved the day. Her method, the Rowan Protocol, had become an undeniable force, a new standard for a new age of aviation. One of the first to champion it was Admiral Patricia Hayes. The Admiral had used Cassie's case as a powerful weapon in her own war against bureaucracy. In a highly publicized speech to the graduating class at the Naval War College, she had declared, "Military effectiveness depends on officers who can make sound judgments under pressure. Sometimes that judgment will conflict with direct orders. Our responsibility is to create a system that encourages the kind of thinking that saves lives rather than punishing officers for making decisions that prove to be correct." Her words, a powerful endorsement of Cassie's actions, had led to a comprehensive review of court-martial procedures, resulting in new guidelines that emphasized the importance of saving lives over maintaining absolute chain of command authority. Admiral Hayes had retired with honor, her legacy secured not by her rank, but by her unwavering commitment to justice. Marcus Dean, the Federal Air Marshal, had become an unlikely ally and a lifelong friend. His report on Flight 322 had been a masterpiece of professional observation. A clinical account of a woman's calm competence in the face of a cataclysm. It was his report, more than any other, that had convinced the FBI and the FAA that Cassie was not a reckless maverick, but a hero. He had been promoted within the Federal Air Marshal Service, and his handling of the incident became a case study in interagency cooperation. He had become a frequent speaker at law enforcement conferences, advocating for better crisis management and the importance of recognizing capability over credentials. Daniel Pierce and Helen Ruiz, the two civilian pilots who had helped in the cockpit, had both found a new purpose. They were both now instructors at the Rowan Protocol Training Center, their unique experience making them invaluable assets. Daniel, the retired airline pilot, had found a new lease on life, his professional awe of Cassie's skills turning into a deep and abiding respect. Helen, the flight instructor, had become a fierce advocate for the protocol, using her experience to teach other pilots that a flight plan was only a suggestion and that a crisis was the real test of a pilot's skill. Captain Nate Delano and First Officer Gene Shaw, the pilots who had been poisoned, had both made a full recovery. Their memories of the incident were a hazy, terrifying blank. They had, however, seen the flight data. They had read the reports, and they had been a part of the national conversation, their gratitude to Cassie a constant public refrain. They had both returned to flying, but with a new perspective, a deeper appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of the Rowan Protocol. Their testimony, a powerful, emotional account of a nightmare averted, had been instrumental in convincing the aviation industry to embrace the new safety standards. The media, which had initially been so frenzied and sensational, had now turned their attention to the long-term impact of the incident. Documentaries and books were written, and Cassie's story became a powerful symbol of heroism. She was no longer the mystery pilot, but a household name, a symbol of courage and competence. Her story was a powerful reminder that sometimes the true measure of a person's worth lies not in their paperwork, but in their character. In a quiet moment, a break between training sessions, Cassie walked over to the plaque. She was no longer a woman haunted by her past. The ghosts were gone. The nightmares had faded. She was defined not by her past, but by her future. She was a legend, a hero, a symbol of courage and competence. But to her, she was just Cassie, a pilot, a woman who had been given a second chance, a second life, and a new purpose. She looked out the window at the sky, a vast, endless ocean of blue. It was a beautiful day for flying, but she knew that in that vast expanse, there were dangers. There were forces beyond human control, and there were human failures, and she knew that her work, her legacy, her protocol would be a shield against them. She walked back into the training center, her head held high. She was no longer a ghost. She was a legend, and she was ready to teach The simulator screen behind her showed a successful landing, the plane rolling to a perfect controlled stop on the runway. The pilots inside, their faces flushed with a mixture of terror and relief, unbuckled their seatbelts, their hands still trembling. They had survived the impossible. They had become a part of the Rowan Protocol, and they would be ready. The lesson of Flight 322, Cassie would often say to her trainees, isn't that people should exceed their authority or ignore established procedures. The lesson is that we all have a responsibility to prepare ourselves for challenges we hope never to face, and that institutions have a responsibility to recognize competence wherever it exists. Standing before an audience of pilots, air traffic controllers, safety officials, and emergency responders from around the world, Cassie reflected on how much had changed since that December afternoon when she had been just another passenger trying to blend into anonymity. The court-martial that had ended her military career was now remembered as an institutional failure rather than personal disgrace. The skills she had maintained during 5 years of civilian life had been validated in the most demanding way possible. But more than personal vindication, her story had become proof that preparation, competence, and courage could overcome institutional barriers when supported by people willing to recognize capability over credentials. The systems changes that had emerged from Flight 322 would benefit aviation safety for generations, ensuring that future crises could be managed by utilizing all available expertise rather than being limited by traditional boundaries. The woman, who had once been told that her judgment couldn't be trusted, had proven that sometimes the most important decisions were made by people who were willing to act when action was required. Her legacy would be measured not just in lives saved, but in systems transformed to better utilize the human potential that existed far beyond the boundaries of formal recognition. The Rowan Protocol became a catalyst for institutional transformation that would benefit aviation safety for decades to come. In the end, Cassie Rowan had become more than an individual success story. She was a symbol, a legend, a testament to the power of one person's courage and the unyielding belief that a hero's true worth is not measured by their credentials but by their actions. That was the story of Cassie Rowan, a woman who flew a plane she wasn't supposed to fly, and in doing so, proved that some skills never truly fade away. It's a story that transcends the metal tube of an aircraft and the physics of flight. It is a story about the profound difference between a credential and a capability, between a title and the true raw substance of what it means to be prepared. For 5 years, Cassie lived a life of anonymity. She was a ghost of her former self, defined not by her extraordinary talent, but by a single administrative decision, a political consequence of a courageous choice. Her uniform was traded for a navy sweater, her cockpit for a desk, and her purpose for a quiet, solitary existence. The system, a vast and unyielding machine, had judged her and found her wanting. It had decreed that she was a liability, not an asset. But, as this story shows, life has a funny way of challenging the system. It puts you in a position where the rules no longer apply and where a title means nothing in the face of an impossible reality. On Flight 322, the only thing that mattered was not Cassie's court-martial, not her lack of certification, but her hands on the yoke. In that moment, she was not a former pilot, not a court-martialed officer, not a civilian in seat 14C. She was simply a pilot. She was the one and only person in that entire metal tube who knew what to do. Her story is a powerful reminder that every single one of us has a skill set, a knowledge base, a deep-seated instinct that we may have forgotten about or pushed aside. We train for things we hope we never have to face. We learn lessons that we think we will never use. We prepare in silence. And in a moment of crisis, those quiet preparations, those long-buried skills, can be the very thing that saves not just ourselves, but everyone around us. The Rowan Protocol is more than just a training program. It is a philosophy. It is a living, breathing testament to the idea that a hero is not born from a title, but from a moment of profound courage. It is an acknowledgement that institutions, however well-intentioned, can fail, and that in those moments we must rely on the human element. We must rely on the one person who is willing to act, to make the right choice, even when it goes against every rule they were ever taught. I think there's a part of Cassie's story in every one of us. Maybe it's the time you saw a problem at work and fixed it, even though it wasn't your job. Maybe it's the moment you stepped up for a friend when they needed help. Maybe it's just the quiet confidence you feel when you know you're good at something, even if the rest of the world doesn't recognize it. That quiet, unspoken competence, that is the very essence of Cassie's journey. It's a journey that resonated with the people around her. It resonated with Marcus Dean, the Air Marshal who chose to trust competence over credentials. It resonated with Daniel Pierce and Helen Ruiz, the civilian pilots who found a new purpose in assisting her. It resonated with Admiral Hayes, the military leader who had the courage to admit that the system she served had failed. And it resonated with Captain Stone, the visionary who saw not a risk, but a revolutionary new way to train pilots. The story of Flight 322 is now a part of aviation history, a case study in courage and resilience. It is a story that reminds us to never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who sit in the back and observe, the ones who have a past that we can't see, because sometimes those are the very people who will save us all. Here at Veteran Biker, we believe that every story has a lesson, every journey has a purpose, and that the greatest adventures are often the ones we never see coming. We tell stories of courage, of resilience, of the human spirit in the face of the impossible. Stories like Cassie Rowan's, a story of a woman who was a veteran of a different kind of war, a war against the machine, against herself, against the odds. She was, in the end, a true veteran of the sky. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. This story was a labor of love, a testament to the power of a hero who was prepared in silence. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Cassie's story, on the Rowan Protocol, and on the entire journey of Flight 322. Please leave a comment down below and let us know what you think. Your feedback helps us to create more stories like this one. And if you enjoyed this journey, please remember to give us a like and a subscribe. It helps us to continue bringing these incredible stories to you. Don't forget to check out the other videos on your screen right now. We have more stories of courage and resilience just waiting for you. Thank you again for watching. From all of us here at Veteran Biker, ride safe, and we'll see you on the next journey.